All right, so let's talk about critical thinking. When I talk about critical thinking, like I said in the last video, there are three or four super important parts to it. So let's start with the first one. The first one that I think is understanding how science works. Science doesn't, well, first let me say the reason science is important is because it's based on shared understanding of the world. The epistemology from the last video of science is such that there's evidence. I can touch a thing, you can touch a thing, we agree that that's evidence. And so, then we move forward to say, well, what does that mean? Okay, but that's just the epistemological part, the shared empiricism. It's important to understand that science doesn't actually work through proving things, science works through disproving things. And the example I use for this is think about those ghost shows that used to be fairly popular, and or Sasquatch or UFOs or whatever you want. If you approach a quote unquote haunted house as if it's a real thing, as if you believe in ghosts, then when you walk in and you hear a squeak, that evidence is going to tell you it's a ghost. When you feel a draft, you know it's a ghost. When something falls off the shelf, you know it's a ghost. All right, but when someone who doesn't believe in ghosts walks into that same house and they hear a squeak, they can't just say it's not a ghost, but they do. You do need to go and find the squeak, and when you have replicated the squeak, you know that the squeak wasn't a ghost. When you follow the draft and notice that it's coming from underneath a door in the wintertime, then you know it's not a ghost. When something falls off the shelf and you go over and you bounce on the floor next to the shelf, you try and wiggle around the house and make a thing fall. If you can't make a thing fall, then you can't say it wasn't a ghost, right? If I can make the squeak and it's the same squeak that we heard, then we can say that squeak wasn't a ghost because I made the squeak. I can say, I know where the draft is coming from. I can show that it's coming from here. So I have disproved that draft is a ghost. But I have not disproved that the thing falling off the shelf was in fact a ghost. So for the time being, we have to say, well, maybe it was a ghost, right? If you take a research methods class, they'll get into null hypotheses and alternative hypotheses, and the process of disproving the null hypothesis so you can get to the alternative hypothesis. We don't really need to do that now. Just know that science moves forward, gets us closer to the truth than ever, that by disproving things one thing at a time. Edison is famously supposed to have said, I haven't failed at making a light bulb. I have shown 100 ways not to make a light bulb. And that's essentially how science works. We move forward by disproving untruths, and that moves us ever closer to the truth. Now you notice that implicated in that, we also, if you're going to be a person committed to the truth, you have to accept that you're likely wrong about most everything, at least a little bit. You will get closer to the truth by disproving untruths, but if you don't think there are any untruths to disprove, then you have God's truth. And I don't think any of us have that level of truth. So that's the first thing. Science doesn't prove, it disproves. The second thing, preconceptions and confirmation bias. And this plays on to, someone's texting my phone. Preconceptions and confirmation bias. Yes. All right. So the way that our brains seem to work is that we think we see something a couple of times, we make a model, and so then we have a model in our heads. And when we see more information, if it confirms that model, we accept it. And if it seems like it doesn't confirm the model, we sort of ignore it. And you'll notice that what I just said about science disproving untruths, you'll notice that the fact that we think in models and using this confirmation bias actually is about the exact opposite, right? If I don't really have an example off the top of my head. If I know that it's always hot in Georgia, and I walk out and it's 35 degrees, I can say, well, either my model is wrong, it may not be as hot in Georgia as I think, or this is just a freak thing today, and it'll be hot again tomorrow. Now, let's think about that in terms of today's election going on. If you're a Democratic voter, so right now it is July 11th, and Biden just had a debate with Trump where he looked like an incoherent elderly old man. All right, so if I'm a Biden voter and I believe Biden is the best choice for president, it's possible for me to look at that and say he just had a bad night. And in fact, that's what lots of the pundits are saying. If now, I don't know whether Biden is any good or not. That's not really the point. The point is, here's my understanding is that this guy's a good president. Here's a situation where, for whatever reason, he clearly did poorly. My preconception is he's a good president, so I'm going to say, hey, well, he just had a bad night. If I'm a Trump voter, and I know Biden is demented and losing it, then I look at that and I say, see, that proves what I already thought. So now there's even another level of why do we think he's the best president, or he is an old man who's losing his mind. Well, the truth of the matter is we don't know either, right? I see TV, I see the internet, I see him acting like a president. I saw TV, I saw the internet, I saw Trump acting like the president. I may have my feelings about both of them, but those are entirely third hand. Like, I don't know either of these men. I don't know if either one of them is smart. I don't know if either one of them is a nice guy or an asshole. I don't know. I only know what the news tells me. And notice, like on the last video, what I think is going to drive what actually the news tells me. And then I don't use contrasting evidence to refine my perspective. I realize that doing a video like this in the middle of the summer, in the middle of a hotly contested election, is going to make this dated fairly quickly. So it'll be interesting to see as fall goes on how that whole thing plays out. All right, check my notes here. So if you're going to want to improve your thinking and be a critical thinker, you have to be able to look at your preconceptions, and you're going to have to actively work against your confirmation bias, and that's very challenging to do. Think about how hard it is going to be for that Biden voter to say, he really might not be capable of being president still, or that Trump voter and saying, this man really might not be good for the country, right? We don't, we're not comfortable with contradictory evidence. We don't like evidence that challenges our thinking. We don't like to think that we were wrong, so we don't like to change our minds. But at the same time, if you're not willing to change your mind when new evidence shows something different than what you thought, then you're kind of stuck on stupid. You're not going to improve your thinking. You're not going to improve your grasp on the truth of the world. That's just where you are. So the first one, science works by disproving. The second one, put your preconceptions aside and avoid confirmation bias. The third one, type 1 and type 2 errors. So another element of all of that is how you build the models in your head based on the different kinds of data and information that you have. So what do I mean by that? In the old days, before we had high-def radio, you would turn a radio station, it would go, and then you get to the music, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then again. There were areas on the dial where you'd be close enough to the station that you got some music, but you also got some static. And so you'd spend all this time, a certain amount of energy trying to get right on the number where you got the most music and the least static. On like old-fashioned CB radios, handheld radios, you have a squelch thing that does the same thing. It turns down the static, and hopefully the sound comes through. We are... there seem to be a certain number of conspiracy theories floating around. I don't really know all of them, and I'm not too interested in delving into them. I did use aliens and Bigfoot and ghosts as an example, so we can stick with those. But a conspiracy theorist is someone who I would say is almost maybe too open-minded, or at the very least, well, actually, let me stop there. As I said earlier, your mind apparently seems to work by seeing evidence and then building a model. We're built to find models everywhere. And, when you look at the clouds and you see a dog, you see a bunny rabbit, then, it's like you're seeing a model. Now, there's not a dog in the clouds, it's just the clouds, but it looks like something, right? Sometimes when you look at the ground, so here's an example. You're walking along, you look at the ground, and you see something, and so you immediately see that thing and jump because, oh my God, it's a snake. That's what my wife does. And it's not a snake, it was a stick. Well, your mind saw some data that had a pattern that sort of matched the pattern of the snake. Because you don't want to get bit and get killed and get taken out of the gene pool. You react to that and jump away as fast as you can. There was less harm in getting scared and jumping away than there was in your mind not assuming it was a snake. Because the flip side of that situation is you are walking along and out of the corner of your eye there's something that might be a snake, but you're going to wait and see if it's a snake. And by the time you have thought through whether or not that was actually a snake, you got bit, you're dying, you don't get to procreate, and you're out of the gene pool. You lose. And so that's essentially what this type 1 and type 2 error is. And that also comes from your stats and methodology class. But essentially, the world is full of data, and we are trying to find patterns in that data so that we can figure out how to actually exist in this world. In looking at data, one type of error is seeing a pattern where there's not a pattern. The other type of error is missing a pattern when the pattern's actually there. Seeing a pattern when there's not a thing there, that's jumping at the stick that you thought was a snake. Not seeing a pattern that is there is not jumping at the snake and actually getting bit. Now, so let's think about this in kind of not snakes and not data, but in well, Bigfoot and aliens. All right. I used the ghost example. So someone who believes in aliens and Bigfoots, if they see something in the sky, I guess that would be aliens. If they see something in the sky that they can't explain and their mind jumps to aliens, they're assuming this pattern, this data meets this pattern that they have in their head. The other person is assuming, who sees stuff in the sky that they can't explain, but they know there's no aliens. So whatever it is just something different. They're missing that pattern that might actually be there. And the reason that matters is because someday aliens may show up. I don't know if they're aliens or not, right? So if the aliens show up, this person's going to be a little surprised because they didn't think aliens were a possibility. Until the aliens show up, this guy's going to spend a lot of time worrying about something that doesn't actually exist. So I would say if you're looking at something like some of the more pernicious conspiracy theories, some evil cabal taking over the world, for instance. Again, I don't know if there is or there isn't, but no, let me stop there. Let me say, and go back to the science example. The reason science is important, and the reason that this type 1 and type 2 error are important, is because you don't do good science if you aren't both open-minded enough to think there might be aliens, but also closed-minded enough to really critique the things that you think are out there so that you can figure it out, which is where I was going with that. So the person who is looking for perfect proof before they believe in aliens, they're going to miss if there ever actually are aliens. They're going to miss the Bigfoot until something shows up, right? And then the person who is too open-minded is going to be assuming that there are Bigfoots and aliens when there may well not be, when there aren't. And the thing is that both of these people are actually missing the truth. And it's when you start delving into the kind of debates that we have floating around. Is the COVID vaccine bad for you or good for you? Again, I don't know. I just know it's timely. Whether or not people liked the COVID vaccine seemed really to come down to their politics more than any sort of actual truths. So the person who says, no, the COVID vaccine is good, you should take it, they're going to actually miss people who really truly were harmed by a vaccine. And the reason I say that isn't because I know, is only because any medical intervention has trade-offs. There will be some people who are hurt by any sort of intervention, especially when you're talking millions and millions and millions of people. And those interventions matter, right? If you say everybody should get this treatment, whatever it is, and 1% of people are having problems, the way to make this treatment better is to actually figure out how to ameliorate those problems, right? But because of the political environment around COVID, these people couldn't actually admit that there was any sort of problems. They're the people who are missing Bigfoot because they won't admit that there's maybe some evidence that they can't explain. The flip side are the people who are too open-minded, right? Um, they hear a few stories um, of people who were harmed. Again, I just know there were people harmed because any medical intervention has side effects when you run it across millions of people. These folks hear however many stories they hear, and so they're assuming the pattern that may not actually be there, right? There's a reason we do these things statistically. You have to, if you're applying something to millions and millions and millions of people, um, you then need to run the statistics on millions and millions and millions of people in order to get a sense of whether it's actually good or bad. Why do I say that? I say that because if you're talking millions and millions, if you're talking a million people, 1% of a million people is what? It's not 100,000, it's 10,000 people. If I heard 10,000 anecdotes of something being bad, I would be convinced it was bad, even though that's a 1% error rate, which may or may not be acceptable. That's why you have to do the statistics and not rely on anecdote. But again, I don't want you to get waylaid with that. I want you to understand that you need to be open-minded enough to see new patterns that might be there, and you need to be critical enough to try and shoot down patterns that you think are there, to try and disprove those patterns that are there. And that's part of this scientific critical thinking, empirically oriented thinking that will make you a better human. I don't think it'll make you a better human, but it'll make you a better thinker and get you closer to the truth. All right, so let me see. Okay, finally, this is the last one. This one ended up longer than I thought it was going to be. Um, so, whenever you're talking about how you build an argument, um, there are a few pieces that you have to be cognizant of to um, in order to understand those arguments, right? One of them, which you've already talked a little bit about, is evidence. But the other one is what are your actual assumptions? And I would see this when I look at religion. I grew up Catholic, so you're going to have to put up with some religious examples. Uh, One of the differences between the Catholics and many of the Protestants is the Catholics aren't biblical literalists, whereas some of the Protestant groups are. So uh, the Protestant and the Catholic may end up with different understandings of their theology because their basic assumption at the starting block is different. What would that be? Well, the Bible is something meaningful and interpretive, or the Bible is literal, right? Those starting blocks lead in different directions when you start building your argument off of that. And yeah, right. And the same thing goes with evidence. So if what's an evidence example? Well, I guess evidence is like the Bigfoot thing. If you saw something hairy in the woods, that could be that could be that's your evidence. Whether or not it's Bigfoot, who knows? But that was your evidence, right? So when you're building these logical arguments, you start with your fundamental building block. You decide what evidence is allowable, and then you logically build from there. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but you see this when you start getting into some of the more interpretive versions of social science, right? If I want to understand a feminist take on Marx, right? Well, Marx's arguments might be the foundation. The evidence I'm going to allow for that the interpretive evidence may well be the feminist perspective, and then I'm going to build the argument from there. Yes. So let's see, what did we do? We did science doesn't prove, it disproves. We have to put your preconceptions aside and challenge your own confirmation bias. You have to recognize type 1 and type 2 errors, which essentially means be open to new patterns in the data on the one hand, but also be willing to critique those patterns pretty harshly on the other hand, and be able to analyze your arguments. What are your foundational assumptions in that argument? What is the evidence you're using that argument? And are the steps from there that you're using to build that argument, do they make logical sense? So that took longer than I thought. So much for shorts. But all right, maybe I'll do a couple more of these. Thank you.